My name is Kalyn Waters. I work in IFAS Extension. I'm in Holmes County, so we're just south of the Alabama border and north of Panama City just a little bit. So I grew up out west. The forage system is completely different and very unique, yet we still rely heavily on legumes such as alfalfa for supplementation within our cow herd. And people always tell me I'm crazy when I say that beef cattle, ruminant, whether it's small ruminants or whatever, the production systems in Florida are very similar to some of those out west. There's a lot of differences in species and weather and things like that. But at the end of the day, we're all working in a forage-based livestock system. And so there's a lot of the same principles really that carry over. And so when I came to the University of Florida in 2009 to do my master's, I had the opportunity to work with Perennial Peanut Hay. I had no idea what it was when I started. And I think it was not new to the South, but it was definitely gaining a lot of momentum at that time as far as really being recognized as a quality forage and something that could be used as a supplement as well as potentially for grazing. And so let's see if I can get my slides. So when I started thinking about kind of how to broach the topic that Dr. Dubay and the committee asked me to talk about, there was really about 100 different ways I could go with it. And there's so many different things that I felt like I could include. And so this is obviously just a slice of the nutritional benefits and kind of some of the ways to utilize legumes within a diet in a livestock system. But we only have so much time tonight. And so I'll try to keep it brief. If you have any questions or discussion, feel free to stop me. We can make it as informal as y'all would like to. And I know that Dr. Dubay and Dr. Di Lorenzo will be happy to add information as well as we go through the slides. So really, when you start to think about harvested versus grazing systems, the nutritional quality of those forages does not change tremendously, the digestibility and those sorts of things, and how those forages are interacting in the ruminant at a microbial level, which is one of the things I'm going to talk just briefly on tonight, because it's very interesting about the value that the legume adds in the forage-based system on a ruminant level. And so we're going to kind of talk about harvested versus non-harvested forages or grazing forages interchangeably. But one of the things that I've really come to learn in the beginning, probably when I was in my infantile stages, especially of my knowledge of nutrition, we kind of have this tendency to think that all feedstuffs are created equal. 5% proteins, 5% protein, TDN, those types of things, shouldn't really matter what type of feed we're feeding those cattle necessarily, as long as they're getting their nutrient requirements met, which in essence is true. But I also think that when you start thinking about grazing and some of the interactions that forages have with other feedstuffs that those cattle might be taking in, there's some really interesting things that can be noticed. And so one of those is a thing called the associative effect. So this is a lit review that was done in 2009, and it looked at the associative effect between different forages on intake and digestion in ruminants. And so there's two different effects. There's the positive effect and the negative effect. Just to make it a simple way to understand it. So when we look at the positive effect, we can see that those forages are interacting kind of in a symbiotic way, or that feedstuff, the feeding of one feedstuff is positively affecting the digestion and the utilization of something else that we've chosen to feed that animal, whether that's in a total mixed ration or maybe in a grazing situation where we might even be supplementing those cattle. And then, of course, you have the negative effect where you're going to see changes in the ruminant environment and different things that are going to cause some of the feedstuffs that you're providing or the forages that you're providing that animal to be diminished due to the other forages or supplementation that you're providing. And so when we think about those two effects, positive and negative, probably the most typical scenario would be when we're supplementing something that has some sort of a forage-based diet with some type of a concentrate. So in general, some assumptions that we can make about the ruminant environment during forage digestion. It typically has a higher pH. For the most part, this because those cattle are chewing. The more cattle chew, they produce saliva, and saliva acts as a buffer within that ruminant environment. And so that buffering effect with the forage intake tends to be one of the reasons why the ruminant environment is a higher pH. And that is the environment that the cellulitic microbes thrive in. So those are the bugs in the rumen that are digesting the feed that we're putting into that animal. And so in that environment, we're going to see an increase in plant matter digestion. And on the other side of the spectrum, something we might see more typical in a mixed ration that we would be providing, or some type of high energy supplementation, we have these really easily fermented carbohydrates, and that tends to create a acidic environment in the rumen. And so as that rumen pH goes down, we tend to see some negative effects on the cellulitic population and how that set of microbes is able to digest forage within the rumen. And so you can kind of see that that would be a negative effect to where we're not able to have two different populations that are thriving within the rumen, and we can see some negative impacts. And so and going back to that, so this particular literature review looked a lot about dry matter intake. So dry matter intake within the rumen is regulated in several different ways. Two kind of elementary ways, I guess, to explain it would be one, fill, two, quality intake. So you can think of it as two different ways. If you eat a lot of bread, you're going to stop eating because you feel full, because your body is no longer able to physically take anything in. So in the ruminant situation, that's called the fill effect. You typically see that in the forage-based systems. That's going to be the main thing that's going to regulate intake. So if we can increase digestibility, we can move those forages through the cattle's ruminant, through their digestive system in a more efficient way, and we can get them to eat more. And obviously, when we're trying to get those cattle to gain, dry matter intake is something that we want to be aware of. So when you decrease the cellulitic digestion, you decrease the rate of passage at which those forages are being broken down, then you have a decrease in dry matter intake. So in several of the studies that this paper that we're about to look at reviewed, they looked at what can we do to support the digestion of forages and increase dry matter intake, because in almost every case when they were able to increase dry matter intake, in cattle that were in a grazed system, they were able to increase average daily gains in basic performance. So this is one of the things that I was going to show from this paper. So this is some information that come from several different sources, but what they typically looked at is when you look at dry matter intake versus the percentage of legumes that was included in that forage diet. So in most of these cases, this was a grazing system of some sort, and then some of those pastures included legumes at a certain percentage. So as the percentage of legumes within the diet went up, in addition, they saw that there was an increase in dry matter intake, anywhere from 6 to 7%. But one of the things that this particular graphic doesn't show is you kind of reach a point to where you're maxed out. So up to 6 to 7%, they saw benefits in increasing the digestion and different things like that, and that drove dry matter intake. But on the flip side of it, cattle that got up into that 60, 70, 80% legume inclusion in that diet, if that wasn't properly managed, you did run into some issues like frothy bloat and high levels of blood urea nitrogen, to where those cattle weren't necessarily utilizing all of the protein that they were ingesting, all that nitrogen. So you saw a lot of that in the excretion and things like that. So the conclusion from this section of this review was basically that somewhere between 25 to 50% inclusion would kind of be the sweet spot for inclusion of legumes, and then that would drive your dry matter intake about 6 to 7%. So some other things that they saw, typically when you included legumes and then you saw that increase in dry matter intake, like I said, you saw a result in animal performance, whether that was in average daily gains or milk production. And then in addition, I think probably the most valuable thing, just from someone in the field, in cattle production scenario or sheep or whatever type of ruminant that you're focusing your production management system on, is that when they included legumes with low quality forages, lowly digestible forages that weren't necessarily probably the most ideal as far as TDN, crude protein, digestibility, those types of things, they saw an increase in the utilization or the feed value of those poor quality forages when they were supplemented with a legume versus when they were supplemented with something like a concentrate. And so I think from a production standpoint, that's some pretty valuable information to have and a pretty powerful thing to know across the spectrum, is that when you're faced with poor quality forages, you almost certainly are going to have to supplement, and all supplements are not created equal. And so when you start to look at some of these associative effects, you can actually increase the value or the utilization of your poor quality forages and try to drive dry matter intake and some of those types of things through the supplementation of a legume. And most likely the explanation behind that would be is those rumen microbes need a nitrogen source. That's kind of their bread and butter. They have to have that to be able to thrive and reproduce and be, healthy contributors to the digestion of that forage. When we start to look at really low quality plants, when they start to break down those nitrogen sources or kind of crude protein, I guess if you would want to think of it as that way, it's not as readily available. So legumes are extremely digestible and they can break them down pretty quickly within the rumen. And so that makes that nitrogen readily available. And that's probably one of the things that kind of helps drive the digestion. And then, the sooner you get that forage through the rumen and into the digestive tract, then that cow or calf or whatever you're feeding is going to go back to eating. So when you increase the rate of passage, you increase dry matter intake. That's a pretty positive feedback loop, and you start to see some of those animals have increased performance. So when you start to think about performance, there's a lot of different ways I think that you could utilize legumes within a really basic production system that many people across the Southern Hemisphere are probably utilizing. And we're going to talk about replacement heifers a little bit, but I think that this could easily translate just about into any production scenario with a ruminant, and likely the nutrient requirements are going to be just a little bit different, but probably the levels at which they would require would be kind of a linear effect. So this is replacement heifers. When I started my master's program, we had the question of, could we supplement with just perennial peanut and feed a Bermuda grass and meet these nutrient requirements? Anybody who's developed replacement heifers know it's not easy and it's certainly not cheap. So what are some ways that maybe we could utilize some feedstuffs that we have here in the Southeast and potentially develop some replacement heifers in a different way. So we looked at the effects of perennial peanut and how we could measure all of that. We measured just about every fertility parameter that you could. We looked at age, weight, days to puberty, all of your, days to pregnancy, weight at puberty, average daily gain, all of those types of parameters. And we did that in 2 different phases. So we had a development phase that was 140 days. And we targeted heifers to gain between a pound and a pound and a half. And then after the end of that development phase, we commingled the heifers that were on that trial. And that was during the breeding phase. So we had 3 different treatments. We had a corn, gluten, and soybean meal treatment. So those heifers were supplemented with the corn, gluten, soybean meal, or they were supplemented with the perennial peanut hay. We did that supplementation to target a pound to a pound and a half a gain. And so we basically calculated out how much perennial peanut hay do I need to feed and how much corn, gluten, soybean meal do I need to feed to get those heifers to gain a pound to a pound and a half a day. And then our control group received no supplementation. So the heifers got their supplements, and then they all had free choice access to fertilized Bahia grass, or excuse me, coastal hay, not Bahia. And so we looked at how those heifers did, and we did this over a 2-year period. So thinking back just real quickly to those 2 different types of associated effects, we really wanted to see if we supplemented these heifers with a legume versus with a concentrate, like we typically are doing in some of our development scenarios in the Southeast. Can we be more efficient? And can we get those heifers to reach puberty and breed and perform like we need them to enter into the cow herd? And what we found is, yeah, we absolutely can. 1, you cannot develop replacement heifers on simply coastal hay. It won't work. They won't breed. They won't grow. The ones that do breed, this isn't included in this trial, but we had a hard time getting them to breed back with their second calf because they were so far behind as far as their mature body weight and those types of things. On our average daily gain, we didn't really see much of a difference. We saw some numeric differences in this trial, but we didn't find any statistical differences between the weights of the 2, between any of the performance of the supplemented groups. The one thing that I will note, while it wasn't a statistical difference, there was a fairly sizable difference, in my opinion, from a cattle producer. If I can get my heifers to breed 88% versus 78%, while that's not a statistical difference, I do think that is a notable difference. And we looked into some of the different ways we can explain that. Obviously, from a research side of things, it wasn't statistical, but I think that there was some benefits that could potentially be explained through some metabolites and different things like that on potentially the improvement in pregnancy rate on those perennial peanut heifers. But I think some of the interesting stuff that really applies to tonight's conversation, and it just mimics the same thing that lit review found, is that when you included a legume within the diet, we were able to increase the dry matter intake of those heifers, even on a kind of medium quality coastal hay. And when you compared that to the concentrate supplemented heifers, that overall the perennial peanut supplementation increased dry matter intake, and they consumed the greatest percent of their body weight on a daily basis. Now, that sounds really great, but the producer side of me has to go back this and look and say that potentially was not more efficient, because we can see that when you look at average daily gain, the perennial peanut heifers and the corn, gluten, soybean meal heifers basically gained the same amount, but we see that the perennial peanut heifers had a higher dry matter intake. Economically, when we sorted all of this out, the corn, gluten, soybean, and the perennial peanut supplementation, there was very little difference in the way that we purchased the feeds, and how we supplemented them economically as far as cost of gain and all of those types of things. However, we were buying perennial peanut hay in square bales. So I think from a production standpoint, if we redid the economic analysis of this, I think you could see that if you were able to buy perennial peanut in a round roll situation, potentially would be a little bit more cost effective as far as feeding large groups of heifers, and you could potentially drive down that cost of development just a little bit. And then lastly, one of the things that we found as far as blood urea nitrogen levels went, and in research, that's just a way for us to kind of analyze how much of that nitrogen is being bound in the rumen or passing through the rumen and being utilized that way versus being absorbed through the ruminant wall and going into the bloodstream, which isn't necessarily the most ideal way for that to be utilized. It's not necessarily bad, but we like to see that protein or that nitrogen getting bound and making energy and resulting in growth. So we really didn't see a ton of differences in the blood urea nitrogen levels between the concentrate heifers and the perennial peanut heifers. One of the things we could say based on those results, there wasn't a statistical difference, but numerically we did feel that the perennial peanut heifers were more efficient. But at the end of the day, I think the take-home message is, one, we did see a positive associated effect from the inclusion of this legume in the diet. And in addition, we were able to successfully develop replacement heifers on strictly a forage-based diet in the Southeast. So we did not supplement those perennial peanut heifers with anything but harvested forages that come directly out of the region. We're able to get them bred in a cost-effective way. And I think that that's a great tool for producers. In addition, I think forage-based replacement heifer development has a lot of positive benefits on the future of how that cow's going to perform, especially if you can develop them in some systems where they're grazing. There's a lot of research that was done at South Dakota State University by George Perry, and he actually showed that heifers that are developed in a dry lot scenario versus heifers that are developed in a grazing scenario, when you take those dry lot heifers out and turn them out on pasture, they typically lose weight, even if they're kept on the same plane of nutrition for up to 4 to 6 weeks. And they looked at grazing behavior, put pedometers on them, tracked mileage, all of those types of things. And basically, when you take those heifers out of the dry lot, they just simply don't perform like heifers that are able to go from the dam straight in to a grazing scenario. And so I think when we look at heifer development, the inclusion of legumes can be a really positive way to set those heifers up to be successful in our herd. So we talked a little bit about heifer development and different things like that, but what are some ways that we can really maximize the value of those legumes in our nutritional system? They're wonderful, and when we have them, we obviously know we definitely want to get the most bang for our buck or the biggest return on our investment. We've spent the time and the money and the energy in establishing those pastures to have legumes in them or to harvest the forage from them. And so what's one of the ways that we can really maximize that? So creep grazing, I think, is probably one of the simplest ways to make sure that the animals that have the highest nutritional requirements are gaining access. So you can see these are two different pictures. This one's actually from the Irish Farm Journal. I just stole it online to show. So basically all creep grazing is allowing a select cohort of animals to have access to a particular field or forage prior to the entire herd. So you can see the picture with the calves. They've set up some sort of an electric fence that the calves are able to pass under, but the cows obviously don't. And then Probably a little more secure method over here with the sheep is where they're using a creep panel. That would certainly work for calves as well. And so kind of the theory behind this would be what we know about grazing behavior, and that animals, regardless of their age or their nutritional requirements, are going to select the most immature green leaves, the new and the regrowth, and then so forth. So in essence, they essentially are going to selectively graze and forage for the highest nutrient quality forages that are available. And so when you allow the calves or what lambs, those types of things, have access to that field prior to the cows, they're going to have access to those high quality forages prior to those animals with lower nutrient requirements. So I think that is a really, I don't know if our faces are blocking that table, so I'm going to move everybody over here. But I don't know necessarily. I think that creep grazing with young animals is something that's a really common practice. But I think it also has a lot of merit when you look at mature animals. So we can see just in comparing mature cows to first calf heifers, there is a tremendous difference in their nutrient requirements, obviously, because those animals are young and still growing. And so one of the I guess production strategies could be to allow those young or growing animals to have access to that field, especially in a rotational system, prior to the older mature animals. In addition, one of the things we can think about, especially in the Southeast, is there are a lot of production scenarios where they don't necessarily have a defined breeding season. And while that's probably a whole nother conversation, we can think about how animals at different phases in the production cycle have different nutrient requirements. So I'm looking at a dry or a shortbred heifer or a cow versus something that has just calved and is lactating. I can see that there's a huge difference in the energy and protein requirements for that animal. And so in those scenarios where you don't have a defined breeding season, and you have animals in every one of these categories, calving, breeding, a dry or a bred cow that maybe you just wean the calf off of, and a heavy bred animal. If you don't have a defined breeding season and you can sort those animals into a few groups and graze the animals with the higher nutrient requirements ahead of your mature or lower nutrient requirement animals, you can get some more bang for your buck and you can have a better chance of meeting those higher requirements. It's kind of a modified creep grazing system, but I think it has a lot of merit. And if you have those types of forages available, it would be the best way probably to utilize those forages that are of a high value. So lastly, as we just kind of wrap things up and think about a few things that we can take home or take out to the field with us, legumes aren't just valuable because they're high in nutrients and, as a supplement, but they also provide us with that positive associated effect where they're going to improve the feeding value, the digestibility, the dry matter intake of poor quality forages. We were not blessed by the forage gods in the Southeast. We have a lot of really good forages, but we don't necessarily have the best forages in the world. And so anything that we can do to improve the value of those forages is tremendous. And those inclusions are going to result and translate into performance almost every time. And so I think that they're a super viable option for meeting the requirements at all production phases. But if you can utilize things like creep grazing or supplementation with harvested legumes, you're going to be able to better meet those nutrient requirements. And lastly, if you fertilized your fields this spring or price fertilizer, a unit of nitrogen last year was about 45 cents, and this year it's about 62 cents. And Jose talked about that last year. That's just the hard truth of production this year is nitrogen is expensive. And so if you can incorporate those into your production system, not only are they going to improve the quality of your forages through nitrogen fixation, but also through digestibility of those other forages. And so I think you should really start to see some pretty unique cost saving opportunities with legumes now and in the future. So with that, I think that we know that in the agricultural industry, we're blessed with a lot of challenges, but we also have a lot of opportunities to be creative and be good stewards and use things that are already there or that are God given to us, like legumes, to improve our production. And so I think that this is just a great opportunity to look at some of those production things that we can do to try to help make our bottom line and carry our legacy into the future. So with that, all of the information that I shared, the presentation to the links and some EDIS documents on creep grazing and those types of things, I put in the comments if anyone's interested. That literature review on the associated effects, a pretty easy read. It's not super heavy as far as scientifically. So if you'd be interested in reading that, that's one I would definitely recommend.
First question, would perennial peanut hay be cheaper or more expensive to feed heifers than the byproducts?
Yeah, that's just a year-to-year thing. This year, perennial peanut hay probably on cost per pound of protein, cost per pound of TDN, most of the time was cheaper. The other thing, at least regionally here, that we run into with things like corn gluten, soybean meal, distillers, we couldn't get them. And so that starts to add some challenges too when you get your heifers or whatever other animals you're developing on a ration. You don't want to have to keep jumping all over the board. So for this year, for example, when you're talking about anywhere from, I mean, there was one time somebody told me that they paid $3.15 or between $3.15 and $3.45 for perennial peanut or for corn gluten soybean 50-50 mix per ton. That's getting pretty hard to convert that and make money on it, especially when you got to pay to have it delivered and everything else. So Nicholas, you might be able to speak to that a little bit more, but it's going to be a year-to-year thing. Obviously, I think it can be very close, especially there's just getting to be more and more perennial peanut available. And so that's kind of helped balance out the market a little bit too.
Yeah, Calyn, just to add to that, you're absolutely right. It's a year to year, but one thing that it seems to be getting worse every year. I just had yesterday, just visiting with people from the feed industry, and the outlook for proteins in the Southeast is not looking great, which it makes it really even more interesting, things like this, or even taking advantage of our high protein content in some of our winter annuals. So yes, it's definitely variable, but it seems to be getting worse. And I think we probably need to take a second look at the impact of things like perennial peanut and the protein that it brings into by grounding and growing heifer diets.
All right, thank you. Our next question, would you see the similar positive effects if you're including clovers with your winter annual grasses that are fairly high in quality?
Yes, you're going to see some, obviously not on the same level. The poorer quality forages obviously are going to benefit more from a supplementation. Jose, you want to speak to that? I don't know if you have any gain trials on inclusion of that in your winter annuals. I think you do.
Yes, in our grazing systems, well, there is always the positive effect of legumes in terms of the nitrogen fixation of the system. But we see more benefits in terms of the nutritional aspects in the warm season, because in the winter the grass has a better quality. If you have ryegrass, also those sort of things, they're pretty good as well. But in the summer, if you get bahia grass or Bermuda or whatever, those legumes they provide more advantage in the summer. But in both seasons, we have also the benefits of nitrogen fixation, which is also as important as the nutritional value.
Jose, have you looked at any cost to gain as far as if you go with like a legume cool season forage mixture versus just cool season forage mixture? Is that cost translate out into gains, or do you not see much difference?
Chris Pravat helped us to put some numbers in the economics, and the grass legume mixes they were more economical. It was better than the fertilized systems, both in the cool season and warm season. So it again varies year by year. And for example, this year, if the fertilizer price high, like you mentioned, it's probably even better for the mixers.
I would think too, it's going to depend on what you're mixing it with. Things like oats, they're not super sensitive for fertility wise compared to like rye and ryegrass. You tend to see more benefit from fertilizing those types of cool season forages, and so that might be, if depending on what you're choosing to mix it with. Obviously, probably oats and a ryegrass type combination makes most sense, anyways, in this area. But I would think too, what you choose to mix it with would probably make a difference. But I know this is the legume conference, so we don't want to sound like legume cheerleaders, but in most every scenario, it seems to be pretty positive way to increase performance. You get the nitrogen benefit out of it. And so you're kind of, working to improve your pastures while you're kind of getting to reap the benefits. As a cattle producer, I get paid by the pound. So at the end of the day, I care about cost to gain, especially on those cool season forages. And so that seems to be translating well.
Yeah, Nicholas was talking about the protein marketing, which is, we need to pay attention to that. And Bill Corn, which is in this call, he made a crimson clover hay, and it's hard to dry. We all know that clovers are not very easy to dry, but he made it. And he sent the forage test of that clover hay. It was like 20% crude protein, 75% TDN. So that's hard to beat, and he made it. So that would be a great, forage for supplementing.
All right. Next question. What kind of feeding losses did you have with the perennial peanut material or feeding the hay versus the commodity? I think you'd have to figure that into the system.
So Nicholas can attest to that. Nicholas was there when I did my master's. I weighed back everything that wasn't eaten, included with the round bales. So when I started and I was like, heck yeah, we're going to do this because this is going to be great data. And then halfway into it, when I was raking up round bale waste for hours, I was kind of second guessing myself on why in the world did I decide to add this to my research. But now that it's over and I can look back on it, I'm really grateful that I did it, because we got some really, really good data about round bale waste and things like that. So in my particular experience with feeding perennial peanut, we feed it to our horses here. I know exactly what you're talking about. It's a wasteful product if you don't manage it correctly. And what you're losing is the leaves. So that's even worse. So when I fed those heifers, we supplemented them every other day. And I supplemented them in a feed trough with their square bales, and there was virtually no loss of the perennial peanut hay. They cleaned it all up every time. I can only think of a few instances where there was a little bit left, and it was most likely the first, week of the trial or so. So we really had virtually no loss of the perennial peanut, but we were feeding it in a trough by hand every other day with square bales. So in a round bale situation, I think that you would have to calculate in no less than 20% loss of your hay, of your perennial peanut. Nicholas, what do you think on perennial peanut loss in a round roll?
Yeah, that's also quite very little data specifically on that, but the problem is what you lose in the situation, like with any other legume, it's the best part. And like maybe some of your other hay that you may or may not lose just the leaf, but on legumes that's a problem. And yes, at least 20. There's some really good data I presented a couple of years ago. It's not specific to legume hay, but to hay in general with the different feeding types. And I always do 20-25% on average, but there was a big difference all the way up to 30, I believe, or 40 even on the just on the ground with almost, if I want to say 5 or 7, which that the best was those conical feeders that have like a pan at the bottom so they can catch some of the fines and they'll still consume that. So you can figure from 7 to 30 and anywhere in between, but 20 or 25, it's a good guess.
I have a producer that feeds a lot of perennial peanut round rolls, and he feeds them off of a solid bottom wagon that has sides on it. There is loss similar probably to what you would have with a like a grass hay round roll. I would say that if you're going to do something like that, you need to invest in some sort either of a bale wagon, a cheap round bale ring probably isn't going to cut it with perennial peanut. And you're also going to want to have to kind of learn how to manage it. So if one thing we know about perennial peanut hay is it doesn't like getting wet. So you're not going to be able to feed substantially more than those animals are going to eat within a certain set period of time. So it'll probably take a little bit of time to learn how to manage that, as opposed to, with a Bermuda grass bale or something like that. I mean, it's not great for it to get rained on, but it doesn't turn into a mess either. So, there are some things as far as feeding and developing heifers and things, but there's a challenge with anything. If you don't feed corn, gluten, soybean hulls right now, how are you going to do it? You're going to have to get a trough, or you're going to have to get, a gravity flow wagon or those types of things. So there's kind of always your infrastructure that you have to set up in order to be effective.
All right, our final question. Would it be possible to actually boost weaning weights by having creek pastures in every field with perennial peanut with the access for the calves?
Yeah, I mean, anytime you supplement those calves in a creep scenario, no matter what you supplement them with, I think you would probably increase your weaning weights. You would have to look at in my opinion, you'd have to look at cost of gain, and kind of see what it costs you to get those perennial peanut pastures established and all of that. The good news is Jose worked hard to get us some NRCS money to strip plant those perennial peanut our pastures, and so I think that that's certainly a viable option. There's a lot of different theories on creep feeding, but I think if you had perennial peanut available, especially as those calves mature, that would definitely be something that they could use pretty efficiently.
What kind of acreage, if you were figuring for a herd, how big an area would it take to really effectively creep all the calves in a group?
You're up, Jose.
We have not done that research here, Doug, but one of the aspects that you need to think is the intake as well, which for that type of animal in the summer especially is not very high. But anyhow, I would guess 10 to 20% of the area would be more than enough. But I need to make some calculations if we have not done the research yet here.
The other thing with that is too, you can kind of do a put and take to where maybe those calves aren't going to have access to that all day, or different things like that could kind of help you manage it. Obviously you don't want to overgraze it. So that would be, it's going to have to be managed. In some cases you might have enough perennial peanut to just go ahead and let those calves come in and out as much as they choose, but probably for most of us, especially where this is it's not new, but it is. I mean, in the production side of things, there's not a ton of people who are grazing perennial peanut or supplementing cattle with it. And so, I think in the last 10 years, we've gained a lot of ground and learned a lot and realized what a viable option this is. The cost of establishing perennial peanut for cow pasture is probably a little high with the NRCS. It's an option now if you can get that sort of money. And so I think that this is something that'll probably ease its way into production and become more common.